Oh hey, didn't see you there. Well, we're doing it. We're tackling the thing that makes anime, anime. No, not quite. What's the actual thing that makes anime, anime? No, what? What word makes a large part of anime to make it animated? Oh my god, the editor's a dumb bag of bricks. The anatomy of anime is a complex physiology, from the eyes of our characters to the ears of the distinct sounds to the moving muscles of the stories. But when it comes to an aesthetic impression basis, like Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, we tend to hyperfixate on one organ. Animation, the skin of anime. Whenever the discussion of anime comes around, which for me is pretty freaking often, Can I Interest You in Unlimited Psychic Squad? Is a perfect 5 out of 10. Animation is one of the key pillars to usually get highlighted. And why shouldn't it? It's literally the originator of the word. It's like if you were having a conversation about Nike sneakers, and you didn't bring up Saturn eating his son and the ensuing Titanomachy. Yeah, it'd be unusual because everyone does it and knows it's coming. But regardless of how often the subject gets brought into a discussion despite everyone just automatically knowing it, it's still an important topic to look at and talk about. The standards of art are always changing from materials to methods to probably the most worthless currency an artist needs to survive, public opinion. And whose opinion is worth less than this goober's? So today we're taking a look at animation from Japan. Yeah, you'd think I would have covered this topic earlier, but you have to understand, talking about the finer points of waifus had a little more priority. And just like Buffalo Bill, we're gonna have to peel back a few layers of the skin if we want to actually understand and get into it, and maybe even become the waifus ourselves. Wait, I think I got lost in my own analogy. So the official date of when anime began is up for contention. Not just for the then rocky archival system they had back then, but you have to define anime itself in that too. The Japanese consider all of animation to be anime, so there are some who would say that Emile Cole's Phantasmagorie is the first. Or if you want to get real picky, the first Shadow Puppets could claim that title. Hell, what about that Benny Hassan mural? Sure, it's not moving, but it's showing motion. Wouldn't that constitute a form of animation? You know what? Fuck it. Cave paintings are the oldest anime. There, that solves that. Okay, so we all know what we actually mean. Animation produced by Japan through a means of projection and showcasing real-time motion. So, what is the oldest anime? Are you kidding me? Yes, even when we narrow it down, there's still a ton of subjective and objective hoops to get through. I'll save you the time in the Google search and tell you that it boils down to 3 factors: age, length, and survival. Age is pretty obvious. If it's the oldest, then it's the first, right? If that's the case, then a little clip called Katsudo Sashin should qualify. After all, it is the oldest on record. And now, time to skirt around copyright law. Probably. Here's the full animation. Yeah, that was, the full thing. I mean, it's nice, but I don't think it's winning any Oscars anytime soon. Not because it's bad or anything, but because the Oscars don't care about anime. You guys nominate Boss Baby, but not any of these? Now, obviously, it's not in the best definition. It was only uncovered in 2004, and it was already in less than desirable condition. It was dated to be at least from the Meiji era, so the latest it'd have to be made was 1912, so likely it was made before that. But even then, there were concerns about its legitimacy as animation. If there's a question of substance, then you'd have the length argument. After all, if you're itching to have entertainment in life, it's not impressive unless it can satisfy the actual itch. Or so my girlfriend tells me. I'll be here all night. Namakura Katana, or the dull sword, is a full 4 minutes, and actually has a decent definition to it. And it's moving. I've actually talked about this short in my very first video, and if you want my full critique there, check that out. Oh my god, the wall is blinding! And there's no hollow! The short itself is fine for 2024, but was probably, holy shit, they got a little guy in there, what magic is this, for 1917, and it's considered by many to be the oldest surviving complete animation. But that's the key word, surviving. The other 2 criteria, age and length, really don't mean much if they don't exist. So while there are records of shorts existing before Namakura Katana, that's all they are, records. They existed, but if the actual films go undiscovered, we can't get a full picture of Japanimation history. So with that, Katsudo Shashin and Namakura Katana will be our official starting points, and as you saw them, they're products of their times, limited in their resources, research, and refinement, which is reasonable because, of course they are. And it's not automatically gonna reach the peak with initial attempts. Exhibit A. What is this lighting? Animation from then up until the mid-1930s was limited to cutout animation, which is a form of stop motion where individual pieces of paper are used to emulate movement per frame. Think early South Park. Soon enough, animation began picking up, having more frames and time dedicated to it, that even cutout animation looked more fluid and less limited, like this short from 1932. I actually thought this was cell animated before actually looking much closer to it. Soon after, 1934 saw the rise of the first cell animated anime. And if you don't quite know what that is, it's basically most of animated history. Now back then, it was hand-drawn and painted, whereas today there's a lot of computers involved in addition to the carpal tunnel. The Dance of the Chagamas, which sounds like a slur if you don't know your Japanese, is a very simple short film about lore-inaccurate tanukis invading a temple. And man, I love this. The animation is so lively and creative, even if I don't quite know what's going on. So it shares that similarity with Evangelion, you know, along with the weird Christian symbolism. And so now we're entering an early modern era, where there's a new style and technique to master, and thankfully there's plenty of time, resources, and manpower to hone this new artistic route. God damn it. Yeah, you can't really talk about the development of anything in the mid-1930s to early 1950s without talking about World War II. It was kind of a big deal back then. Like if someone brings up 1492, or whenever the McRib is back. Man, 3 international disasters. When will humanity learn? It's important to note that even before 1939, Japan wanted a very nationalist outlook for its citizens, whether it be as an educational tool or a political stage, so there are shorts with very strong iconography from that time frame. Animation was steadily improving during this phase, even as a propaganda machine. With money garnered from various government agencies, animation directors could experiment more with the craft, like in Ari-chan the Ant using a multiplane camera. It would eventually come to a point where it can be produced in a long-form format, as seen in Momotaro, Sacred Soldiers, the first feature-length anime. This is another one I've delved into before, so I won't dwell on it too much. The animation is rather impressive for the time. Being that it is a full movie, I'm sure there had to be more time and polish dedicated to its production. Not to mention that it was military sanctioned. Gotta burn that Navy money somehow. It's also worth noting that this is the last anime I could find before the end of World War II, as, well, you could imagine why. Afterwards, the animation industry did have a few setbacks in recovering from the war, but ultimately it persevered, with independent and major studios collaborating more than ever to get a fresh new start in the industry, and artists emerging and re-emerging to make names for themselves. During this time, anime was limited to short films and commercials, as the demand for them weren't exactly top of the list. But what did come out managed to pull in new innovations and techniques for the time. I mean, look here, stop motion animation. This was before the 7th Voyage of Sinbad, so eat your heart out, Ray Harryhausen, you hack. And look at this, full color. God damn. Don't jump scare me like that. Yeah, I'm glad Japan decided to reinvent colors in the 50s because I was getting tired of monochromes rolling over us in the past 2,000 years after normal colors went temporarily extinct. You know, as told by the cave paintings. This was an especially great innovation for 1958, where both the first made-for-TV color broadcast and the first full-color feature-length film made their respective descension on unworthy keisters. Life would just never be the same without the masterpiece that is Panda and the Magic Serpent. You know, considering that this guy's waifu is the female lead, that may not be an exaggeration. It's definitely sarcastic, but not too far-fetched. By this time, this movie had the most dynamic animation of the era, featuring a lot of cuts, varied angles, and sharp movement, all in color. It was something on par to some of Disney's best work, and this would escalate even more as the studio Toei would work to improve their techniques with other films, like Magic Boy and The Little Prince and the Eight-Headed Dragon. It's also around this time when anime started morphing into a more distinct style, as they diverged from a Western-centric look similar to its peers like with Disney and Warner Brothers. Japan began early development into the modern form of their signature techniques and movement, behavior, and emotional range. To emphasize, they always had this style, from the exaggerated expressions in ukiyo-e art to the bold body language of no theater. It's just the technical limitations that restricted their animatic side in the early days. But now, as we enter the 60s, we can see a slow change in favor of adapting creations of Japanese artists while maintaining emphasis on an aesthetic feel, like complex backgrounds and atmospheric holds on shots. So a little more time at the office. Osama Tezuka is a prime example of this. With Astro Boy, there's a lot of attention brought on the character, so the shots with him have to have this heroic, dynamic feel to them. And in order to do that, even the smallest details with and without him can bring the scenes to life. Which really helps, because if not, then you just have a kid with funky hair and a speedo in a white void. And that's not as interesting, depending on who you ask. I would argue that this era was the birth of modern Sakuga. If you're not too familiar with what that is, it's a term used to describe incredible, highly technical, and fine animation that brings attention to key moments or details. It's also a term I will now obnoxiously keep referring to throughout this video, like a smarmy 9-year-old who just learned a vocab word beyond his reading comprehension levels. That is so incredulous. This fight scene from Naruto is an example of Sakuga. The transformations from Sailor Moon are also famous examples of Sakuga. This scene from Nisa Monogatari, yeah, you get the picture. And it's here where we can see the roots of it. Yeah, these action scenes aren't impressive by today's standards, but back then, I imagine it's like watching a real-life Iron Man destroying tanks. But, you know, animated. But it's also in this time frame where studios and animators had to make adjustments for these moments. As with just about everything in life, animation costs money. And for as desirable it is to have unlimited money, it's not as easy to attain. What are we, Iron Man destroying tanks? A key component to animation, especially hand-drawn, is resourcefulness of techniques. And the most resourceful is arguably animation cycles. This is simply the reusing of animation, and it occurs in just about every 2D cartoon, or it has been used at some point. Watch this Bugs Bunny cartoon for an example of this. You'll notice the screwball animation in Winding Up a Pitch is actually done the same here. And then again here. And while not all instances of animation recycling is obvious at first, that at first basically doesn't exist in anime. Anime is pretty infamous for limited animation and stills, with loopy mouth movements and dead-eye blank stares all around. To take things a step further, anime adapted to limited settings with key finite angles, lower frame rates, and often long-held shots. And to reiterate, this isn't a bad thing. Aside from budgetary reasons, these techniques were honed over the years to adjust to a modernizing Japanese theater and a growing medium, akin to cinema like a Kurosawa film. And frankly, it's probably the better alternative versus killing over an extra 50 to 500 new frames. Of course, the biggest benefit to these limited animation moments, or I guess sometimes episodes, is saving that money for the money shots, those Sakuga scenes. So I guess you should disregard my relaxing over not having to do more work comment I just made. Damn it. Sakuga is just that important to the integrity and longevity of anime. It's in the endearing limited scenes that the audience can take in the atmosphere, exposition, and character of the story, but when there needs to be action or something of high note, you gotta kick it up a notch. And a good way to do that is to literally make a scene. There's very few things that are more exciting than watching colors explode and bodies move in ways you never perceived to be possible. I can name a few, but overall, the exhilaration of watching a story slowly piece itself together as a buildup of emotions and efforts on animators and characters' parts is a high that can rarely be topped. Maybe a few things can compete, like, I don't know, Iron Man destroying tanks. See, I can use limited animation too. Whether if it's in the boxing ring fighting for your purpose in life, or in the final frontier saving the galaxy, making huge waves in the changing environment, or just taking a potato chip and eating it, charging up your ultimate move, or just getting started, it's in the animation that carries the weight in how these emotions and moments are translated. A shot like this one, where characters are just standing around, isn't really anything special. But put these same characters on stage and dial the visual attention to detail to 11, and it culminates in a wonderfully animated scene and, probably more importantly, a memorable one. It's in these Sakuga scenes that we can ultimately see where a ton of effort and thought was utilized in making something like this, or this, or this stand out and conquer our brain stimulations. And it all stems from working with the limitations of time, budget, and the rest of the animation themselves. A big advantage to the early days of Saka is managing those techniques, honing the art of looping and adjusting to the stories. But it's not just the process that got its work done, it was also something that I'm constantly using. Style. Style in animation is a phenomenal part to the art's identity. Like with painting, composing, writing, or taxidermy I assume, the diverse portfolio of animation is one to cherish, in that it takes all sorts of forms to convey its rights to the eras and privileges to the public opinion. What do I mean by that? Well, take Osamu Tezuka for example. His artistic motifs include a cinematic framework, a lot of moving camera work, and an emboldening of his characters and their personage. He has a certain drawing style of keeping the heroes in a pure sense, so even heavy scenes or plots would have an element of whimsy. Plus, he's kind of the patron saint of the whole anime aesthetic. Apparently, he was inspired by Disney cartoons to draw the expressions of big eyes, though I couldn't find a specific cartoon or character for said reference. Regardless, it's Disney's fault that this exists. God, I can't believe they got away with it too. This is definitely the worst thing they've done. And as more artists and creators popped up to make their own standing inspired by Tezuka, well, that's basically it. They managed to stand on the shoulders of giants and with one another to forge their own recognizable styles. Hayao Miyazaki and Studio Ghibli breathed life into nature and machinery through fluid coloring, spirited characters, and areas full of life. Satoshi Kon morphed the weird and rambunctious into surrealist imagery mirroring the human psyche and social nature. Akira Toriyama envisioned heroism through the paneling and pacing of journeys drowned in crescendoing action and lighthearted gag humor. From the storytellers and the studios, the advancement and discovery of new styles brings the variety in anime to regard the medium's ever-growing audience, so that they aren't stuck with 1 or 5 ways of telling and showing a tale. There are hundreds, maybe even thousands of distinct renditions to anime, depending on where you look. It's also here where you need to somewhat know the difference between style and design. Style is bringing attention to realism in an appealing way, and design is the way to do that. Granted, that's a really easy example to make of, but hopefully you get it. The practicality of animation is that it needs to tell some sort of comprehensive narrative, and the way to do that is through storyboarding. How every element is placed or every movement is utilized is up to the discretion of the director, and the elements themselves are handled by a team of artists like the animation directors, character designers, and scene managers. Through this, we can see how effective the vastness of space is in Cowboy Bebop, or the power behind each of Star Platinum's flashy punches, and how they work in the unique styles of the shows, because they were known to be done so. And then, even there's a ton to consider. Remember, it's not just about the animation or the consistency in style or placement, it's a multitude of things. Signature moments like the head tilts in the Monogatari series, or even the change in style like in mini-comedy's formatting. This bleeds into other factors. Scene work, background details, and consistency in imagery are lesser thought of when it comes to animation, but they're still obviously important. Like a small ensemble in a huge orchestra, or the rest of the Backstreet Boys to the powerhouse that is Howie D. Actually, these minute details are gradually improving as these recent years go on. Watch this scene from the original 79 Mobile Suit Gundam. It looks nice for the time, and it gives off the impression of an open developed world, albeit slightly lacking in depth in life. Then look at this scene from 2002's Gundam Seed, where there's more action, but more notably, a larger depth in the environment, more details on the trees, and more moving elements, granted with looping animation cycles. And then finally, take a look here at 2017's Iron-Blooded Orphans, where there's a greater landscape all enveloped in various shading and lighting sense, along with finer details on the dirt that is almost overshadowing the characters themselves, who are subjected to animation restrictions. And personally, I think it's when you can look at the individual aspects and really appreciate them to a point where you can ignore the characters for a bit, where animation truly shines. You know, like some fucking nerd who actually has their opinions. Like me. In the 90s, computer animation in the industry took off, with movies like Ghost in the Shell and Princess Mononoke kickstarting the technological revolution. Who would have guessed Skynet would have a degenerate cousin? When implemented right, the mixing and sometimes full usage of computer-generated graphics can elevate the mystique and technical prowess of the art. Some of the best, most memorable moments in anime from the last 30 years had at least a bit of computer assistance. The Fate series instantly comes to mind in how gorgeous and impressive the industry advanced with the technology, and Attack on Titan evolved with the growth of this bluey medium. Heck, that's not to mention that anime is just easier to draw and produce now more than ever with the addition of new techniques and technology, like tablets and editing software. And don't get me wrong, when the 3D crumbles, it really falls. Everyone's aware of how janky Berserk 2016 was, or whatever the fuck those amorphous goat blob things were in Overlord. Yeah, they didn't exactly reach the pinnacle they needed to. It could have been a directional choice or a cut in the budget, but in the end, the final product was what mattered, and they didn't work. I get it. But when you look at a show like Land of the Lustrous, you can't imagine how absolutely extraordinary the Sakuga looks without being CGI. Or on another end, there's High Score Girl, which is steeped in charm on how low its frames are and engage you on its motifs, which happens to be gaming, through that lens. The way I see it, the best CG in anime are those you don't see, as if they were actually hand-drawn. Not because we want more of the old classic look, but because those cases can produce new ideas and fresh innovations that simply can't be produced with pencil on paper. Imagine if Leonardo da Vinci had access to a computer. He'd be like, "Che diavolo è questo?" And then he'd likely move on to go do Da Vinci things with the computer, accessing more ideas and pioneer things he couldn't have without one. It's the same principle, and sometimes we just take it for granted without having realized it. Animation is just amazing in that retrospect that, for as grand and prominent as it is as a major component to anime that is practically the word, that we can still overlook the pieces that make it truly amazing. The grandeur of any creative work is that it's a methodical process, and every piece seems to have a natural flow to them to make them fit. And in the charm of anime, even with those parts that can be seen as setbacks like looping animation, slow frame rates, sudden changes in standards in Sakuga, CG work that sticks out, and background work that doesn't stick out enough, they still operate functionally well in the branding and style of anime and even influence contemporaries around the world. The animation of anime is one of my favorite things in the world. The work behind the process and the magic of all we see on screen is nothing short of a technical and aesthetic stride in reaching new audiences and conveying story through art. And as the years proceed, we find that that art goes beyond the boundaries of what it means to imitate and create life, one animal girl at a time. But now, if you'll excuse me, I can't help but feel like I forgot to write about something. Something that I really wanted to commentate on during this video. Hold on, let me turn on my thinking speakers. Oh my god, I forgot to talk about anime openings.